again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm an old school person, so I'll say good afternoon, boys and girls, although much of our audience today are students. My name is Solomon Lausch. I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this forum on foreign policy today with the discussions that we'll be having. I'm pleased to welcome to you today's panel. To my left, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan, and to my right, Congressman Dan Meuser, who together represent most of Berks County in the House of Representatives in our national government. I would like to acknowledge the corporate sponsorship of the following companies that have underwritten 3/4 of the cost for the high school students and advisors here today. Their names are listed on the program agenda at each of your places. Please join me in thanking Customers Bank, East Penn Manufacturing, Enersys, M&T Bank, and Penske Truck Leasing. The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading focuses on issues relating to world affairs. We've invited Congresswoman Houlahan and Congressman Meuser because they each serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Today is a wonderful day to be focusing on our American form of government. Next door to us here at the DoubleTree, as we speak, the Berks County Bar Association is celebrating National Law Day, a day set aside to renew our commitment to the principles of government by law. America is, in fact, the longest-standing democracy in the world, as this year we recognize the 223rd year of our Constitution. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government conceived by man, except all the others that have been tried and failed. Today and next door, we are here to affirm that the rule of law and representative democracy is alive and well in America, and surely locally in Reading and Berks County. We affirm that civil discourse can and does prevail today in the matter of foreign policy. The program today serves as an example of representative government at its best, a lesson for each of us and for all of us, most certainly for the students here in attendance. Representative Dan Meuser represents the 9th Congressional District, including most of western Berks County. As noted, among his committee assignments, he serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Representative Meuser is an American businessman. As a Republican, he previously served as the Secretary of Commerce in the cabinet of Governor Tom Corbett. Representative Houlahan represents the 6th Congressional District, including Reading and much of eastern Berks County. As noted, among her committee assignments, Representative Houlahan serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She is an Air Force veteran, engineer, entrepreneur, and educator. She is a Democrat and also the first woman to represent the 6th Congressional District. Please join me in welcoming Representatives Houlahan and Meuser. The format for our program for the remainder of the day is as follows. Representatives Houlahan and Meuser will each speak 4 or 5 minutes on topics of their choosing relative to foreign policy, and they will address those individually. I will then present some questions developed by our program committee and also a Penn State student for the ensuing 20 to 25 minutes. The representatives have received copies of the questions in advance. The remaining 20 to 25 minutes will be devoted to questions from the audience. At your places are pens and cards for you to use for this purpose. About 12:30, 2 students will begin to circulate among you to collect the questions and give them to David Bean, our vice president, who in turn will compile them to share with the representatives. I will then conclude with some brief remarks. I flipped the coin in my head, and we'll start with Representative Houlahan and her 4 or 5 minutes that she would like to address us.
Well, that's a statistically accurate way of doing that. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. Good afternoon. My name is Chrissy Houlahan, and I do serve us in Washington in the 6th Congressional District, and that is all of Chester County and the lower parts of Berks County, including the room that you're sitting in. I'm a sophomore in the Congress. That means that I'm in my 2nd term. I have now been serving about 3 and some years. Very, very grateful to be in service of my community, the 6th Congressional, which is a fascinating study in our democracy. it is, roughly speaking, 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% independent. So it's one of the very, very few districts in the country that have that really purple essence to them. And it's really important to recognize how unique that is, to also know that that district is suburban, next to the city of Philadelphia, in Chester County and areas here in this area. It's rural in places in Berks County with dairy and mushroom farms in Chester County as well. And it's urban in places like the place that you sit. Also a really, really unique community. By way of background, as you mentioned, I joined this body kind of unexpectedly, really felt the need at this very important inflection point in our community and the Commonwealth and the country to help by serving at a time when we're very, very divided, trying to bring us back together. By way of background, I am the daughter of a naval officer and the granddaughter of a naval officer, and many, many members of my family have served in the military, including myself. I served as an engineer up at Hanscom Air Force Base at the beginning of my career, and I've been here as an entrepreneur in the Chester County area ever since, for about 25 years, growing and scaling relative to this conversation organizations and companies that started locally and grew nationally and then internationally. So I've spent a lot of time overseas with these companies. I also have been an educator of chemistry in North Philadelphia, and I lastly helped grow and scale an organization that focuses on early childhood literacy for making sure that we have equity and justice in the way that we educate our communities. I tell you all of this because this is where my perspective is of service. My perspective is one of local service, but it's really hard not to realize that we're part of a huge web. We are a web that is community-based, that is county-based, that is Commonwealth-based, and is country-based, but we're lying to ourselves if we think that we can close our eyes and imagine that the rest of the world doesn't exist. And so I'm very grateful in Congress to be able to serve on some of the committees that I think most make sense given my background and given our community's needs. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee along with Mr. Meuser, and very grateful that's one of the few very highly functioning committees in Congress that are very bipartisan. I serve specifically on the Asia Subcommittee and a new committee that focuses on the role of the corporation and the role of the nonprofit in the globe, which I think is a really important thing to think about as well. I also serve on the Armed Services Committee. I'm the only Pennsylvanian on both sides of the aisle to serve on that really important committee, also a highly functioning committee relative to the rest of the committees in Congress. And lastly, the Small Business Committee, and that really has a lot to do with why we're here too. The interconnectivity of businesses with one another, with businesses across the world and across the globe is really important. When I started running for Congress, very, very few people ever asked me questions about the globe. In fact, until very, very recently, I could count on two hands the number of questions I got from my community about things that were not about our nation. And that has really changed in the last 2 months, frankly. The penetration of Ukraine, the conversation about what that means for democracies around the world and what that means for not only Europe and not only our nation, but also for the Far East and for Indo-PACOM, has actually made a dent in the conversation locally as well. So I'm very grateful for that because also by way of background, I'm the daughter of a refugee. My Navy officer dad was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was born in Lviv, which is now Ukraine. And so it's all come full circle for me to be here now talking about these issues with you, and I'm grateful to be able to do that in a bipartisan setting, very much focused in my tenure in Congress on civility and decency and making sure that we're bringing ourselves together rather than tearing our nation apart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Solomon. Thanks to the World Affairs Council. Thank you to my colleague, Representative Houlahan, very much for being here, and thanks to all of you. I appreciated Representative Houlahan's words very, very much, and I very much concur. I, too, when figuring out what committees to be on, I think about my district first. I think about Pennsylvania. I think about how I can most effectively serve my country from the experience that I have. And I'm on the Small Business Committee, along with Representative Houlahan. And Foreign Affairs was something that I got on largely because I felt it had great effects on, clearly, the issues facing our nation. Very serious issues. We have oversight of the State Department, basically. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. We have oversight of the entirety of the State Department as well as the embassies. So we have them in for committee hearings. We get the opportunity to speak with Secretary Austin, Defense Secretary Austin, often classified and unclassified meetings. Secretary Mayorkas, who's head of Homeland Security. So that provides us information on a bipartisan basis, of course, to weigh in, make decisions, and far more than weigh in, create legislation that's in the interest of the United States, right? But in the interest, in the end, of the world, because what's in the interest of the United States should be in the interest of the world as well. And as I keep almost calling her Chrissy.
It's okay, please do.
As she stated, it's a very bipartisan committee, usually, right? We certainly have our share of debates in committee, and they're lively and useful, actually very useful. Chrissy and I also sit on the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a caucus of 29, I think it's 28 now, 28 Republicans, 28 Democrats. And believe it or not, we get along. Our meetings well, not initially. The first 20 minutes of the meeting is we're looking at each other. The second 20 minutes, okay, we can find some common ground. The last 20 minutes is probably some of the most worthwhile time of my week. Because we do actually come up with solutions. And no matter which way you want to slice it, we've got to work together. I'm a conservative Republican. Chrissy's a Democrat. That's what makes up our country. That's what makes up our state. It's virtually almost 50-50, or with the 10%, 12%, maybe more than that, independent. So we've got to find ways to work together. There are serious issues facing our country in Africa, Central America, very, very important part of the world right now. I do believe in much stronger border security. I do believe in a higher level of comprehensive immigration reform after the border security. But I also believe in getting to the root causes of the issue as to why we have the refugee problem that we have. As a matter of fact, we had Samantha Power in from USAID not too long ago, and we had a detailed conversation about that. The Middle East is still a hotbed. Some real serious things happening there. There's no question the Abraham Accords that took place were a very positive development. South America, we have China making unusual, perhaps, or new investments in South America, in our hemisphere. We've got to keep a close eye on that. But of course, the big ones are really right now. Well, we went through Afghanistan. That certainly was a huge issue for months for all of us. Doing what we could to ameliorate and provide information and provide funding and provide legislation during that crisis. But we have the Ukraine. The invasion by frankly, what's I think it's fair to say a maniacal tyrant decided to. It's really Putin's war. Decided to invade a free, sovereign nation with no provocation whatsoever. So what do you do about that? During the buildup, we had many meetings, and I know we'll have discussions on that. We provided funding. Some could argue it was a little slow. Some would argue it was appropriate. But those are discussions we will have, and those are the discussions that we do have. And what do we do moving forward? So again, our committee plays a vital role there, as well as I mentioned the southern border. I'm sure we'll get some questions on that, but as well China. Right? China is a significant threat to the United States, and in many cases to the world. We like to view them as a worthy adversary. Well, they're a little bit more than that. with COVID, with what occurred there, with what many would argue, and I would, that there was a cover-up. I frankly don't think there was anything deliberate, but there was a cover-up on their part, and it continues, as well as aggressions that they're taking that they view that are in their interests, right? They view in their interests. So the United States must understand what's in our interests and how can we respond to what they do without creating world war, right? Because it's been done, certainly been done before, and it must be done again. But we're still the United States of America. We are in the position of strength. We are continue to be the most powerful, and well, frankly, that means something in any negotiation, whether it's with Putin, Xi Jinping, or the other issues that face our country. So, with that, Solomon, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you giving us some good introductions. We do have a series of questions that you have received, and I would say almost a third of them, though, focus on the whole issue of Ukraine. So we have questions such as, and I'll ask Congressman Houlahan if you'll lead off on this, and then I'll switch around to the next set. But what accountability do you envision for holding Russia accountable for the massive destruction and carnage in the Ukraine? And how do you evaluate Russia overcoming this blunder that it has taken itself into?
Well, that's a complicated question with probably a very elaborate and lengthy answer, but we don't have time for all of the kind of depth of that it deserves. What I would start is by backing all the way up. This is not a blunder, in my opinion. What Putin is doing is part of a plan, and it is a plan that is larger than just Ukraine. He has visions of restoring sort of the sphere of influence, to use kind of his terminology and the terminology parlance of the defense and national security sector. He believes he's under threat. I believe he's paranoid and disillusioned and delusional, but he believes that he needs to create that, USSR kind of feeling again, once again. And so he will start in a place like Ukraine, and he will not end in that place. So I think we need to take this very, very seriously. Somebody said, and I don't know who it was, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that if you look kind of 80 years back to my my dad who was a small child then, and you see what looked like the beginnings of World War II in that very part of the world, and then you start looking eastward to Asia and see what happened in Asia as a consequence of what was happening, in Europe, and you see the implications of how that kind of festered and grew into something much, much bigger. We have a chance to make sure that history does not repeat itself right now. We have a chance to make sure that we're protecting and helping the people of Ukraine, who at this point in time have only just asked for our help. They have not asked for American boots on the ground. They have not asked for American pilots in the air. They've just asked for weapons to be able to protect themselves. And I think that we will agree that they should get everything they're asking for. I hope that that's probably, I don't want to state something for you, but I have been very, very adamant with this administration, calling out this administration to make sure that everything that Mr. Zelensky is asking for, that we gravely consider whether or not it's appropriate and give it to him. And so that includes aircraft, that includes anti-missile and anti-ship weaponry. But what I would also say is this war, I don't think any of us anticipated would be as long as it was. I don't think many of us anticipated how much of a fight the Ukrainian people had in them. I had the opportunity to go with a bipartisan delegation weeks before the war started and meet with President Zelensky. I don't think he had any anticipation that this was going to happen. And so I think that now that we know that this is going to be longer than any of us would like it to be, we need to start pivoting in the way that we're thinking about the resources we're sending the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian Ukrainian people, because it's a longer time horizon than any of us imagined. So that means that we might be thinking about training people in weapon systems and aircraft that they don't already have the native ability to do. That means that we might want to be thinking about how we're shoring up their crops and agriculture, because a lot of the world's food supply comes out of that area. It might mean that we're trying to figure out how we're trying to bring humanitarian assistance to not just places like Poland where people are washing up, but places like Ukraine where they still are. So we have a lot of responsibilities to think about. One thing that I would also tell you about my privilege to meet Mr. Zelensky in those weeks before is that he didn't really believe that this was going to happen. In fact, he asked the delegation to not talk about it. He asked the delegation to stop talking about the threat on their borders because he thought that it would ruin the global markets. He thought that it would ruin the Ukrainian economy. He thought that he basically said, where have you been since 2014? This has been the situation that we've been facing, and so this is just another day in the life of Ukraine. So even he did not believe weeks until the attack that this was going to happen, even though we were telling him over and over again, bipartisanly, that it was happening. So that's just a little bit of a history lesson from a couple months ago.
Thank you. Congressman, same topic, then we'll move on, and perhaps more briefly, to a couple of other topics.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what Representative Houlahan had to say. I'm largely agreeable. The idea, it's true, Zelensky and the Ukrainians really were not preparing in a manner that they were anticipating an invasion to this scale, or perhaps any scale. Our administration, the Biden administration, issued some terms along the way. They were classified. But look, there's no looking back, but there is learning from the past. And we must be able to, however, issue issue terms of what will occur should this type of escalation continue. We have to position ourselves from strength. We can't be in position of accommodation, and I think that goes for many issues and potential crises that exist on a worldwide basis. So I hope those discussions, and hope is not a strategy, those discussions should be taking place with our State Department through diplomatic back channels, as has occurred throughout our history with Russia. And perhaps we can gain some sort of level of a ceasefire, perhaps a peace treaty that must be in the interest, of course, of the Ukraine and the world. Nevertheless, that certainly doesn't seem to be the case. As Representative Houlahan said, this will likely prolong. The end game for Putin is not eastern Ukraine, and so I think war is his end game. So what do we do about that? What we do about that is we have to defeat them. We have to defeat them, and we defeat them militarily, but we also defeat them by sanctions and cutting off all funding and purchasing of his natural resources, primarily oil and natural gas. And that needs to occur. Now, unfortunately, Europe set itself up to be, to be virtually at the mercy of Putin. 40% of their oil and natural gas, up until August, was coming from Russia. Heck, I mean, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was reauthorized. So those were perhaps mistakes, but again, all we can do is learn from those mistakes, respond to them as favorably as possible, and I think it also lends to, as we need to look after our best interests, why we need to be energy independent, right? I mean, you hear how we were also funding the war by buying Russian oil. Well, we were, but we've been doing that for many years. Nevertheless, prior to this, or prior to just a few years ago, we were buying from Russia because it was a market smart thing to do. It was less expensive. It was the right crude that we wanted, and et cetera. And maybe it was the most competitive price. But because we slowed down our domestic energy production, which we did. I mean, as the numbers are there. We became dependent on Russian fossil fuels. So those we can't have an ideology. And look, I want to be as green as anybody else, but in an economically feasible manner that makes sense for our country and doesn't put us in jeopardy. So any geopolitical event that occurs, our gasoline prices skyrocket. And what happens then? Inflation and food prices go up. Fertilizer, any farmers in the room, we got, it's 4 times higher than before to fertilize an acre of farmland. And just where I'm going with this is everything does kind of tie together. It is important that we recognize the strengths that we need to maintain. And we should have learned from this, right, over the years. Any sort of crisis that occurred in the world, particularly in the Middle East, when we were dependent upon OPEC, gasoline prices went up, and there were shortages and such. So we kind of allowed that to happen. I think we're responding back favorably again. And it's very important. If we can cut Putin off from all the finances that they receive, because many have referred to Russia at this point in time as one big gas station, right? That's where all their revenue comes from. The world would be in a better position, and can't go back, but we can go forward. We need to get there.
Thank you. Congressman, in your opening remarks, you referenced China, and we know that China is the big tuna in the world, so to speak, in some ways. We had several questions here that we proposed on this. And should the United States be investing more in countries around the world with development, such as China is doing with its Belt and Road Initiative? And as you indicated, heavily involved even in our own sphere in South America and Central America. What should we be doing in terms of our competitive perspective with China in this respect?
Well, great question. The U.S. actually has foreign aid, even at this day and age, 10 times that of China. Perhaps that shouldn't be any surprise, but we do. But the China is very aggressive. The CCP is very, very focused. It's sort of a phenomenon of an authoritarian group, because it's a Politburo, basically, right? It's the CCP. It's the Communist Party of China that has this one-party system that runs everything, and they do it in a nimble way with no real thought in mind for human rights. But what's good for the state is good for the individual. And somehow or another, they've kept it going, right? I mean, the Soviet Union tried to do this, and it broke up. And it largely broke up because, well, the military, the government, and the party were run by separate interests. And so Xi Jinping is determined not to make the same mistake, so he controls everything. But it will be a failed state because people can't live like that. They're not going to live and be told what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, and you're going to be shut down, and this is the job you're going to do, and you're not going to have really any opportunity to move forward. But onto the Belt and Road. So they seek out their prospects for investment through Africa. Let's use that as an example. They'll lend an African nation a few $1 billion to build a dam or roads or highways or infrastructure. The moment that country defaults or is late in their payment, they confiscate it. So the world is not trusting China. So that's a good thing too. The world trusts us. The world wants the U.S. to be involved. So we need to be. Now, on the same note, we're running $30 trillion deficits. So we can't just hand out money because we don't have the surplus to do that. But we need to be smart enough to create good relationships that have an economic interest for all parties. Yes, bringing the private sector into it. And I would say in Africa, Central America, South America in particular, and our investment banking firms. I mean, there's more investment taking place in China still to this day. So we need to help correct that. So we once again, look out for our interests, but our partners as well. Win-wins. You know, there's no business relationship where it's I win and you lose, right? It needs to be win-wins. And China, well, is frankly, that's what they're known for.
So what I would add to that is my background is in industrial engineering. What I've done in the civilian economy is grow businesses and scale businesses in logistics and transportation and infrastructure areas. And that's where some of my experience, particularly in Asia and specifically with China, comes from. Spent a lot of time in China as a professional, and I love the Chinese people, but we should be all very open-eyed and clear-eyed about how the Chinese government and the Chinese structure works. It is not exactly even close to exactly the way that our country works. It is very unified both in terms of the government and industry, the private sector. And so when you're talking to the private sector, you are actually also talking to government, and we should, as citizens and as consumers, understand that. So what we can do about that is recognize that we need to divest ourselves as much as possible from our relationship to China, particularly in manufacturing, particularly in things like chips and those kinds of things, because we're vulnerable because we depend on their economy for our economy to work. So some of the things we can do is, I just got back from a trip to India and a trip to Australia where I was talking to them on the defense side of things about supply chain integrity, about making sure that we had things like rare earth elements and critical earth elements available to us and not through China, which is where largely all of those supplies come from. We can make sure that we support legislation like one piece of big legislation that I'll go back to Washington on and work on is the Competes Act, or USICA, on the Senate side, which makes sure that we're more competitive domestically in manufacturing, that makes sure that we are more invested in research and development than we have historically been, and that makes sure, particularly on things like chips, that we have more independence. The other thing that you guys can do in the audience is recognize that you're consumers and you're investors, and that you need to make sure that you're pushing our government, but more importantly, the private sector, to move out and away from China. This takes decades to do. It's a terribly complicated process, but we need to find ways to work with our allies and work with our peers who have like-minded value systems to make sure that we are less dependent on China.
Very poignant question, and not necessarily needing a lot of elaboration, but we'd like your perspective. I'll start with you, Congresswoman Houlahan. Should the United States consider rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement?
I believe so, yes. And I'll leave it there.
Congressman Meuser.
You know what? I think so. I think it needs to be reviewed. We need to make certain that it is, in fact, in our interests again, and in the interests of all parties. And as long as it is fair, it is free and fair, then we should participate. I think over the years we got trade a little bit wrong. We felt that, hey, free trade is really all that matters. Oh, they might manipulate their currency, but and Japan, even our very good friends, might have a 40% tariff on U.S.-made automobiles, but that's okay. We're still going to live with that. Those days need to be over. It needs to be free and fair, and then absolutely, I believe we should strongly consider re-entering that agreement.
Thank you. We'll take one more question prepared here, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. I think we all realize in a short time frame of an hour and 15 minutes, or even thereabout, it's difficult to get any deeply into the surface. But we get a real feel for what our two leading congressmen here, how they sense things and how they are willing to work in a collaborative way. And that's a big part of what we're about today. So, Congressman Meuser, should the United States continue to be an integral partner with NATO, within NATO?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think our NATO organization and partners has proven itself here to be extremely important. I think it was a bit of a wake-up call as well to some European nations that they ought to be anting up. And as you probably have seen in the news, that countries such as Sweden and Finland want to be part of NATO. And, I think that is a very good signal, certainly to Putin, but also to China. So, yes, NATO has proven to be very important.
I 100% agree. Had the opportunity to be in Brussels a few weeks ago, talking to our NATO alliance and to our to the Parliament as well, EU Parliament. It's really heartening to see how energized and united the European continent is, and how much they understand what is at stake. I think, as Congressman Meuser mentioned, I think it is a wake-up call for not only them, but for us as well. And as he mentioned, in terms of others who are thinking of joining the alliance, I think it hopefully is a real wake-up call for Putin, because it's exactly the opposite of what he wanted to accomplish by going into Ukraine. But I think importantly, we should be looking at other alliances around the world. In the Indo-Pacific, as an example, there's a relatively new alliance with Australia and the UK and ourselves. There's a new alliance that's largely economic called the Quad as well. So we need to try to make sure that we're thinking holistically and globally, and not just sort of with just the European continent, about how we're thinking about the threats to all of us.
Great. Okay, Dave, if you would like to bring some questions from the audience.
Oh, here we go.
All right, yes, it's on. So a very good discussion today about bipartisanship, and there are several questions here from the audience concerning that very issue. Question number one, do you believe that the reduction in bipartisanship in this country has harmed discussions concerning foreign policy? And if so, what steps must we implement to reduce its negative impact?
Who first?
Representative Houlahan.
Yeah, I think that the American people, I really do believe that we're a pragmatic and largely moderate group of people. And I really do believe that we just want our government to work, and we want people to get along. And I think that we have a system for lots and lots of different reasons that doesn't allow that to happen very, very well. And so I do think that the partisanship has made it harder and harder to talk about global issues, and we get more and more insular as a result. But we absolutely have to think about ourselves as, the leaders that we are on the world stage, and we also have to absolutely recognize that, as we learned with COVID, that we are all so interconnected with one another that, if somebody coughs in Asia, that we're going to get the flu. Those kinds of things really are truisms, and investments in relationships globally pay back in dividends here locally. So it's a force multiplier to be worried about what's happening around the world. It comes back to you and pays itself back in multiples.
Representative Meuser?
Well, yeah, and I definitely agree. Far too often the first response is party-driven and seeking political advantage as opposed to a solution. Right, that's what tends to be the initial reactions, and how to get an edge and differentiate between parties, as opposed to offer problem solving that is for the greater good, and can also get done, which means that you can't make a good plan today the enemy of a perfect plan tomorrow, or vice versa. So we're getting there. I know it doesn't seem that way. Media, I mean, it's either extreme one side or the other. It tends to be, but when we have serious issues such as we are being presented with, I think that tends to bring us together as not red or blue, but red, white, and blue.
Thank you. So pivoting to Ukraine, which has been a topic of discussion here this afternoon, I think all of us can agree that the United States has a role to play in arming the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army to defeat this aggression. Is there, however, a threshold, a tipping point, beyond which we might not be able to go that could risk direct military involvement between the United States and Russia? Representative Meuser?
Well, if I heard the question right, there's the discussion of responding in kind to the certain escalation of Putin. And so Putin does have tactical nuclear weapons. He has chemical weapons. So if he were to be as maniacal as he seems to, I'm not going to say seems to be, but could be, and these are things that we must take into consideration, right? I mean, we need to be wargaming that. We need to be prepared, and frankly, they should know what our response to that would be before it happens, in my view. So we need to be prepared to make a promise / a threat and clearly inform what our full response should be. And clearly that should also include the NATO alliance and our NATO partners. It shouldn't be necessarily a decision made by ourselves. Nevertheless, the U.S. needs to lead.
I worry about this. I worry about what it will look like when we reach a point where a cyber incursion that crosses boundaries, weapon system, errant weapon system that crosses boundaries. What will that look like when we are pulling NATO into this in a way that we aren't right now? So it's our responsibility, I think, as members of Congress and as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to keep asking the questions, keep, making sure that there's oversight, keep pushing on the DOD and on the Secretary of State and the State Department and the administration, to be really careful, with what we're doing. But the stakes are really, really high here. And we also need to be finding ways, if possible, to give Putin off-ramps. I haven't really come up with any that he seems to be willing to take. But I think that it's really important to try to also de-escalate and take the temperature down as well. I would say it's related to the last question too, sometimes the best conversations that we have together are the ones that are in private. They're in a SCIF, in a classified facility, or they're in a meeting room that's not on C-SPAN, or like all of those kinds of things give you actual opportunities to say something real and to express, concern without having to be put on Twitter, the next day. So that's something, even though we value transparency and we want to make sure you guys have insight into everything we're doing, there's some value sometimes to not having, a microphone in your face all the time.
So the next two questions, in light of all the students here, offer both of you an opportunity to give us a civics lesson, so to speak. Representative Houlahan, I was actually surprised to hear during your introductory remarks that there is a nonprofit subcommittee to the Foreign Affairs Committee and the role that nonprofits can play in influencing and impacting American foreign policy. So I'd like to know more about that and how that works. And we also have a question from the audience about, can there be a general description here about how the Foreign Affairs Committee works? How often does it receive regular briefings? From whom? Who does the committee make recommendations to? So if you could both provide us sort of with a civics lesson on both of those two questions, that would be great.
Well, I'll start with just talking a little bit about this subcommittee. It's a new one. It's a committee not just about the nonprofit and the role of the nonprofit, but it's also about the role of the for-profit sector, both domestically and globally as well. When we talk about places like Africa or South America, Latin America, places that really need investment in the people who are there so that they don't become the problems that are here. There is a huge role that 90% of our economy can play, and that 90% is the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. So I was intrigued when this committee was created just a year or so ago and asked to join it, because that's a lot of my background, having built a bunch of businesses and particularly focused on corporate social responsibility and ESG, trying to make sure that our for-profit sector is just as engaged in solutions as we are from a humanitarian perspective or a State Department perspective. So the jury's still out, to be honest, on how effective that committee is, but that's one of the reasons why I decided to be on it. I moved off of the Africa subcommittee to do that, to give you some kind of perspective on how we all do. Civics lessons, we each usually serve on two committees, sometimes three. I serve on three. Usually on those committees, you serve on two subcommittees. I serve on two in armed services, two on foreign affairs, and one in small business. One of the things, a civics lesson, when you watch C-SPAN and you look out on the little television and you say, where the hell is everybody, right? Because the seats are empty. The reality is there could be 3 or 4 committee hearings going on at one time. I could be in all of them. I will have gavelled into one, and now I'm rotating around to the other ones to get my 5 minutes of questions in. And I really think that this is part of what's broken about Washington is you guys who are students and you've been in high school, you've inevitably had a block schedule, right, where you know what class you're supposed to be in now, and it can't conflict with another class, and you have extra periods for labs and all these other kinds of things. We should be able to do that in Congress. We should be able to not have us be in 5 places at one time because it doesn't serve us well. It doesn't allow us to listen to each other when we're in those committee hearings.
Well, Foreign Affairs Committee, again, is an excellent committee, as I mentioned, oversight of the State Department, which is perhaps, the Secretary of State is usually in administration the primary member of the cabinet. So we do have quite a bit of interaction with Anthony Blinken, Secretary Blinken, and Wendy Sherman, who's his deputy. Really sharp lady that I don't always see eye to eye with, but she's clearly knows what she's doing. But we provide the funding, right? So that's very important. Even what's taking place now with the $33 billion that may be passed for the Ukraine, we're very much responsible for weighing in there. It wouldn't get done without our committee. Our ranking members have sign off on weapons distribution. Even the many different types of weapons that are being sent over to the Ukraine right now don't go without our approval. And it would be interesting for the young people here. I tend to suggest it, but come down to Washington sometime. We'll maybe Representative Houlahan and I will help pay for your bus ride.
It'll be fun.
And we'll we'll walk you through. And I promise you will have a very interesting day and quite an experience. We'll show you as much as we can.
So several questions concerning China and Taiwan and the correlation between what could happen in East Asia, comparing it to what is happening in the Ukraine. I guess the questions concern, what is Congress doing to manage that relationship between the People's Republic and Taiwan? And beyond that, then, what is the administration doing as well to attempt to minimize that risk of us seeing a repeat in the Taiwan Strait as to what we're seeing right now between Russia and Ukraine?
We are trying to learn from what's going on in Ukraine and take the lessons for what could happen in Taiwan in real time. We're trying to also talk to the Taiwanese and tell them, look what's going on over there, guys. We should take this seriously. Obviously, Taiwan and Ukraine are very different in terms of their cultures and very different in terms of their topography and geography and very different in terms of a lot of things. But we still have quite a lot of lessons that we can be learning real time and applying. So they are very much conversations that happen not just in the foreign affairs space, but on the DoD side as well, to make sure that we don't have history repeat itself and that we move things quickly to be able to help Taiwan.
Yeah, by all means. I think this is I think Xi Jinping, the leader of the CCP and president of China, is watching this very closely and probably doesn't like what he's seeing. Certainly believed that Putin would go in and take over Kyiv within a matter of days, which is really what the intel suggested. Both, as Representative Houlahan said, both Zelensky, Russia, and frankly the United States believed that would have been the case. So the Taiwan issue is very, very serious. I think the Biden administration is paying extremely close attention to it. We do get classified and unclassified briefings as to the level of uncertainty and threat. What we can say from an unclassified basis, China is regularly, the Chinese Navy, which is growing rapidly, is regularly circling Taiwan. Largely has it surrounded at any given moment. So that's certainly creates a little bit of unease and tension, obviously, particularly for the Taiwanese. Now, there are some countries that have been recognizing Taiwan, which is kind of interesting. Nicaragua, or is it a couple of the Central America countries? And we get to meet with the ambassadors. They're in our office somewhat regularly from various countries, and China comes up as does the Taiwan issue. So they've war gamed out various potential scenarios should China be very aggressive here with Taiwan. And I think from our standpoint, helping to fortify Taiwan now, where perhaps Ukraine was not, is one response that we're engaged in. China's obviously not going to like that, but that's something that's in the U.S. interest and the interest of the world. So it's a very tenuous situation. We need to make it clear to China that them taking such a aggressive or invading Taiwan is very much not in their long-term interests. So we just got to prove that to them regularly. Now, we saw what China did in Hong Kong. We have to be very wary of that. As Representative Houlahan was bringing up, cyber attacks and things of that nature, they actually occur in Taiwan weekly. It's almost like test pilot programs from emanating out of mainland China from the CCP. So it will continue to be a somewhat of a dangerous situation.
And the last thing I'd say is China is not Russia in their capabilities. China is China and has much stronger capabilities. And I will just leave it at that.
David, suppose we take one more audience question and then we'll move toward a little bit of a wrap-up with a more general question yet.
So our final question then will be another civics question. Representative Meuser, you began things this afternoon with opening remarks that touched on the immigration threat at our southern border. Obviously, there's a lot more to immigration than just the southern border. I mean, we have Afghan refugees that we're now assimilating into this country. I guess there's a very clear, not threat, but opportunity for the United States to assimilate Ukrainian refugees as well. From a civics perspective, what is the role of Congress in immigration? And I'm sure you can both touch on that point. Representative Meuser, we'll start with you first.
Well, we could make laws that would need be followed, and the president would have to sign off on those laws or legislation or veto them. And at the present time, it doesn't seem as if we're prepared to agree on what needs to be done and that is border security, that is high fences but wide gates, that is being a welcoming country but having a lot of control and understanding as to who's coming in, that is sending the right message to Central America and Venezuela and the world that we are not open for entry for any reason whatsoever. And that's a real misnomer, mistake, propaganda that's driven largely by the cartels and the coyotes, as they call them, to encourage people to take $8,000 or $10,000 of their life savings and hand it to a mule or a drug dealer, drug smuggler, and be told that you can gain easy access to the United States and we will help you. I mean, that's happening. I've been to the border twice. I'm sure Chrissy's been there probably maybe more than twice. And that's happening. All right, Customs and Border, there's human trafficking taking place. We've got a real conundrum, if you will, but we got a major human crisis at our border. I mean, we've had CBP look at me, Customs and Border Patrol, look at me in the eye as they're processing a young person or an older person. Frankly, you don't know if they're 17 years old or 24 years old because they're not carrying ID. And very often they have an address and a phone number written on their arm or their back or in a little plastic bag and the CBP agent is sitting there trying to data process and get somebody on the phone to see where they should send them because they're either a minor, which right now we're allowing unaccompanied minors entry, or they're seeking asylum. So under these, and really engage in what's called catch and release, right? They come in, they plead asylum. If it falls within the realm of what our asylum laws allow for, we set a court date for them. And if their place where their sponsor will be is in Minneapolis or Wilkes-Barre or Reading, they're given access to those areas until their asylum date comes. So tens of thousands of illegals with no identification whatsoever are entering our country. And I don't think anybody agrees that that's a good thing, particularly under the misunderstanding that they are provided of what the entry status is, right? So we need to correct this. We need comprehensive illegal immigration reform. Again, we need border security first. I mentioned the root causes end of things. That's important, but in the longer term, and that needs to be publicized, right? We need to be promoting that and working that. Now, on the same note, we've got a lot of farmers and service industry, and not just that, but workers in general, extending work visa programs and things of that nature. But again, we must bring order to it. And it's a shame right now that we're not coming together to create the right plan that frankly makes sense to all of you in the end.
I would probably say that of what Mr. Meuser just said, I agree with 95% of what he just said. We may disagree on the margins and we may disagree on some words, but these are really big pressing issues. And the original question was, what should Congress do? Congress has a responsibility to do something about this issue because I am the daughter, as I mentioned, of a refugee. One generation later, I serve on the House floor, in the greatest nation in the world. We are a nation, a compassionate nation, a nation that wants to take people and benefit from all of the people that we can. We are also a community where you are sitting right now with a 3.2% unemployment rate, with plenty of jobs that need to be filled, whether they're with farmers or in high tech. And so we need to find a comprehensive way to address this issue collectively. We have a responsibility to work together and find that solution. The problem is that we are kind of constantly being pitted against one another, and that compromise is very, very elusive. It's very, very hard to sit down and find that large, big plan. And so I'm torn, because in one way I believe that the only way we can accomplish this is with a very large and very comprehensive plan. But the other way that we can accomplish some of this is by biting off small chunks. You talked about visas. You know, there are ways that we can address the issues that we're having with our dairy farmers and with our mushroom farmers right now. We just can't seem to get there. We can't seem to get to yes on that. And so it's frustrating because the cycles are so strong in terms of the election process that we are kind of have a year to try to get something done and then a year to behave, you know, in a nonsensical fashion to one another. And that's unfortunate. So I try really hard in my role, in the way that I comport myself, to say that there is always a time that I would be willing and able to sit down and talk about these issues. I hope that just as one of 435 that my influence will matter, but we can have a conversation about how hard that is at a different time. But it is really our responsibility as members of Congress to solve for this.
Thank you both. So I'll turn things back to you for some closing remarks.
Okay. Well, we wanted to thank them both, and we're going to do that in a more of a formal way in a second. May I just say, I want to acknowledge the schools that are here, because your presence has been a really big part of what we're about today. We have students from Daniel Boone, Exeter Township, Governor Mifflin, Muhlenberg, Reading High School, Tulpehocken, and Twin Valley. Adults in the audience, could we join them? Also, folks, at your table, there's some literature about the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. There's a way for you to join. There's a membership information there for you. We welcome you to join us. There's no particular cycle per se for the joining, although we'll have a focus on in the next month or two coming up. But there's literature there and also things just generally about us. Please take that with you. I'm going to ask my wife if she'll, there's 2 bags near you, if you'll bring them up here. And we have something for our congressman. I'm going to ask them if they will just briefly reflect on this following questions, a good general way of wrapping us up. The United States' security and global prosperity are tied to a robust diplomatic presence. What is your evaluation of the state of our diplomatic presence worldwide?
We have work to do there, too. We have a lot, dozens of unfilled ambassador positions. Many of them have been nominated, and in the Senate, for all the things that we can talk about, the Senate has not moved forward on confirming those diplomats and those ambassadors. We, until quite recently, and there's lots of people to blame, didn't have an ambassador to Ukraine. And so we have issues there. We have issues with morale in the State Department. We need, I think, to spend, frankly, more money on State Department because this is our first line of defense coming from a military family. My father always said the D in DOD is for defense. It's not the first thing that you do, it's the last thing that you do. And so humanitarian efforts and diplomatic efforts are things that are worthy of investments. We only spend about 1% of our budget on these issues, and as you can see, they are front and center in our lives right now.
I would say the world is welcoming the United States to participate and partner and be the leader for benevolent diplomacy. I really feel that way. Every ambassador, whether it's the Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Central America, Australia, they want, all throughout Africa, they want the U.S. to be there. They want the U.S. to step up. They see what the alternative is. And frankly, in many cases, the alternative is the CCP. And you notice we tend to we say CCP. It's the Communist Party. It's not the Chinese people, right? I mean, it's a Communist Party of China, and they're very threatening throughout the world. And obviously, we see where Putin is. So so that's a good thing. So what do we do with that? That doesn't mean that we're Santa Claus. We can't afford to do that, but we can be very, very smart partners, have regular contact, be approachable, and work together to grow those economies and to help them achieve their own national dreams. And I don't say that. I mean to say that in an ethereal way. There are many There are many driving initiatives throughout Africa, for instance, that they really need our assistance. They're abundant in natural gas. We need to be helping with that. They also have some of the best planes in the world for planes, meaning land planes, for wind and solar. So, and that level of energy is crucial to their development and to bring in more economic prosperity. So there are ways of us to engage there, and you know what? We're going to do it. We're going to do it. Young people here, you think you guys going to do it or what?
Well, if I could ask, the last thing I would say is of the young people, we need you.
Yeah.
We need you to be engaged in government. We need you to be engaged in diplomacy. We need you to be engaged in foreign affairs. And we need the face of the State Department to look like the face of our nation. So when you're thinking about things you can do to serve, please be thinking about service in places like this, in the State Department and otherwise. And with that, I'm very appreciative of being here with you guys today.
Likewise.
Well, Congressman, representing our local Pennsylvania Dutch culture, which I'm really happy to be part of, we have some ceramic here depicting our local Pennsylvania German culture, produced by local artists. And we'd very much like you to have one each here. So here you are.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
folks, would you join me one more time in saying thank you very much to our congressman for giving us their time today. Thank you, sir. Very well done.
Hey.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Very, very well done.